That may be the greatest catch I've ever seen in my life.
Okay, we're going to go through and talk about some of these buy low wide receivers. Honestly, I think the buy low wide receivers this week are a lot more intriguing than these buy low running backs. And I will say, I think we have crushed our buy low wide receivers so far this year. You know, some of the names that we have highlighted at length, whether it's videos or me just begging y'all to trade for them in live streams. We got players like A.J. Brown, Keenan Allen, Calvin Ridley. And I will say really quick, I know we've had a lot of people in the comment section going, oh, Mason, you were so wrong about Calvin Ridley. Oh, Mason, you were so... Are you an idiot or what? How the hell am I supposed to know that Calvin Ridley is going to take time off from football? Do you think I'm out here telling you that I'm DMing with Calvin Ridley on Instagram and I know exactly where his headspace is at? Are you freaking kidding me? Regardless, don't get me started on that. Let's give away some free Fantasy Flock Network hats. Our first one going to come out from Danny. Says, was not happy to draft Eckler late in the first round now, but I'm good. Hopefully no injury back for him. I'm sure you are happy that, my friend. Our next one coming out was from Joe. Says, you hate to see it. I guess not drafting him was still good advice. I think we got lucky with Derrick Henry. I'm still happy with my Devontae Adams pick in the first, as am I. But of course, every time you go down there, drop that like, leave a comment on a video, you get entered in to win a free Fantasy Flock Network hat. If you win, just send me an email ASAP with your physical address. You can find our email in the description of the video. And what you can also find in the description of the video is the link to join Patreon. Our Patreon community pretty much has everything you could ever ask for. We have our updated rest of season rankings every single week. We have our dynasty rankings. When you join, I do an in-depth podcast breaking down your fantasy team personally, and you also get to play in dynasty leagues with us in the offseason. You get to get into our fantasy football group chat. You get our draft guides, yada, yada, yada. Go join Patreon, and let's just dive into it. Let's go over and let's talk about Justin Jefferson here. And with Justin Jefferson, this is a wide receiver that, I think that people really haven't given him his respect this season. Now, yes, he's coming off a very down week. On Sunday night, so everybody saw this game. This is something that we talk about a ton, but usually these Sunday night, Monday night, Thursday night games, if you are on primetime, if the entire country is watching that one game, people are going to overreact. It's the funniest thing ever, but if you have that blow-up game on Sunday night, that blow-up game on Monday night, your fantasy value moves drastically more than it would have on Sunday morning, just because people see it on TV, so it means that much more. In reality, it shouldn't. And with Justin Jefferson, yes, he was very disappointing this week. He comes out 4 fantasy points. But one thing that does not show up in the box score is the fact that Justin Jefferson was in and out of this contest with an apparent lower body injury that there have been no reports coming out as of late. So what we can read into this with Justin Jefferson is that this is a wide receiver that just dealt with a nagging injury through this game against the Dallas Cowboys. Based on the fact that we haven't had any reports here, I'm operating under the assumption that Justin Jefferson will be good to go rest of season. And if Jefferson's limping around on the sidelines and he wasn't good on Sunday night against the Dallas Cowboys, I think that we can take that game that we had from Justin Jefferson. We can essentially throw it out the window, say that this is something that does not matter to look at in the entire context of what we have had from Justin Jefferson this season. You have the entire Minnesota Vikings offense pretty much just stalling out, but this offense is run through Justin Jefferson. And you had Jefferson on bye in week 7, so now this is back-to-back weeks where you just haven't had Jefferson producing, so the owner may be getting a little bit frustrated, as crazy as that sounds. But if we're going to go through, look at the first 6 weeks this fantasy season, what I really like doing about this is we get a better context overall of where Justin Jefferson was with everything being neutral, with all these wide receivers being healthy, with Jefferson being good to go every single week. And we actually noticed this trend about week 5, week 6, in those live streams that we do every single night. But people were valuing Justin Jefferson as he was a wide receiver too. He wasn't being valued in the same tier as someone like Jamar Chase, as someone like Deebo Samuel, someone like DJ Moore, who had put up a wide receiver 1 production so far this season. And I think the reason for that is with those other wide receivers, whether it's Mike Williams. With Mike Williams, you're getting a massive blow-up performance, 36 fantasy points. Devontae Adams, 37 fantasy points. Tyreek Hill, 47. Cooper Kupp, multiple 30-point games. Jamar Chase, his own 30-point performances. I mean, pretty much every single wide receiver that you have found in fantasy so far this season, I mean, they have hit those peaks of 35 fantasy points where they're straight-up league winners on their own, and then they're the story of the fantasy football community the following week. That hasn't happened with Justin Jefferson. It doesn't really matter though, because if you look at the first 6 weeks this season, Justin Jefferson was the wide receiver 5 overall. He was a top 5 option, just as you drafted him to be at the 2-3 turn in your fantasy draft this year. But the reason that he wasn't really being discussed is because the production just fell in line in a very stable grouping. He was essentially giving you 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 points. I mean, right in that range every single week. This is a wide receiver that if you were looking at the volume was perfect. 9 targets, 10 targets, 11 targets, 7 targets, 8 targets. He had 14 targets in week 6. This is a wide receiver getting close to 10 targets a game going into year 2. Yes, we didn't get the massive 30-point jumps, but you're not having any of those dud performances. This first dud performance for Justin Jefferson was in a game where he was in and out with injury. So Justin Jefferson is a wide receiver that I think was a little undervalued coming into this past week based on the extremely high floor and ceiling combination that we know he has. Now, I think that he is going to continue to fall in value based on the fact that he just dropped 4 points on Sunday night against the Dallas Cowboys, but it was in a game where he's limping on the sidelines. I think we can almost take it, throw it out the window, buy low on Justin Jefferson, still a top 10 wide receiver in fantasy easily. Now, our next wide receiver, I mean, this is an option that we said not to start this past week. We said we definitely want to be adjusting some other wide receivers in the offense, but Jerry Jeudy himself was someone that we were going, okay, nope, you can't put him in your starting lineup. I want to see what he looks like coming back from the high ankle sprain before we make any rash decisions here. And with Jerry Jeudy, I mean, I'm kind of glad that we said that because he comes out, only has 7.9 fantasy points. This is an option that only had 4 targets in this Denver Broncos passing offense, but it's not necessarily against anything that Jerry Jeudy did. It's more so the entire offense kind of flamed out with Denver going up against Washington. And with Jerry Jeudy, you would naturally assume that this is a player that continues to expand his role as the season goes on. This is a player that continues to get healthier and healthier. I think week 2, when you come back from these injuries, as we have seen from Dalvin Cook, as we're about to see from Nick Chubb, that's the week when you should expect that massive jump up. You get Jerry Jeudy coming back right away into this offense, and he leads this team in receptions. We have said that Jerry Jeudy is going to severely handicap Noah Fant. We have said that he's going to severely handicap Courtland Sutton, and that you needed to sell those players before Jerry Jeudy returned because Jeudy was going to be the wide receiver 1 in Denver. You weren't expecting the massive blow-up performance his first week back from the high ankle sprain. You're expecting that a little later on. So I just want to put this out there saying, I mean, we're still on that exact same course with Jerry Jeudy. Do not panic because he only gave you about 7.9 fantasy points this week, because I think the best is yet to come with Jeudy. Now let's go over to our next wide receiver here, which will be an easy call in my opinion, Chase Claypool. Now, with Chase Claypool, this entire offense failed in Pittsburgh this past week. I mean, really, the only player that was productive was Najee Harris. You know Harris is going to be productive regardless, but Claypool actually was very encouraging with how you saw that Pittsburgh was trying to force feed him the ball here. I mean, with Chase Claypool, they had a very hard time going through and actually getting him targets in this offense because obviously Ben Roethlisberger, his own arm strength, something that we talked about coming into the season, simply isn't there. So the deep targets for Chase Claypool are going to be non-existent in Pittsburgh. So, I mean, they're trying to get him worked in. They give him 2 carries. They get 16 rushing yards, which obviously isn't massive in us trying to determine where we should be moving Chase Claypool in our fantasy rankings. But what is pretty big is the fact that we still see that volume going in the way of Chase Claypool, yet his value should be continuing to go down after back-to-back down performances against the Seattle Seahawks and the Cleveland Browns. I want to remind y'all, we called him a sell-high player back in week 5 5 after he had 6 targets, 130 receiving yards, and 5 receptions, because you know that rate of efficiency is never going to maintain over the entire season for a given wide receiver. But at the same time, Chase Claypool is very similar to Tyler Lockett, in my opinion. I would say that Claypool is how you would view Tyler Lockett with a bad NFL quarterback, and that while, yes, you're not necessarily expecting the extremely high floor on a week-to-week basis, but you know that the ceiling performance is going to be there for Claypool to ever come away with 30 fantasy points in a given contest. I mean, Deontay Johnson getting the majority of the targets here, but this was a game overall that Big Ben only had 22 completions. I'd imagine that we actually get this number bumped up in higher scoring contests going forward, knowing that, yeah, the Steelers defense looked really good this week against the Cleveland Browns. They're not going to be that way the rest of the season. These next 2 weeks against the Chicago Bears and the Detroit Lions, I'd imagine that Pittsburgh is able to lean on the run, just given the fact that those opposing offenses won't be able to put up points. So maybe you want to buy Chase Claypool in a couple of weeks rather than right now, but I still think that Claypool has the talent profile. Clearly with the Juju Smith-Schuster injury, his snap rate is higher than it's ever been before. I think that Claypool is an intriguing buy low candidate if you sold him high just about a month ago at a much higher premium. Okay, so now let's go over to our next wide receiver, and we are going to be bringing him up because we've talked about him for 3 weeks in a row now. We are going to continue to go right back to the well. It's easy enough. Let's go T. Higgins. And with T. Higgins, I mean, my God, everybody who faded T. Higgins got lucky this week. Okay, so you know that we said to play T. Higgins everywhere, trade for him everywhere, and you've heard me copy and paste this statement over and over and over again in those live streams where back in week 7, 15 targets for T. Higgins, where yes, you had Jamar Chase going over 200 receiving yards. Yes, you had CJ Uzomah dropping 25 fantasy points, but Higgins was the number 1 wide receiver from a volume standpoint in Cincinnati. The week before that, he actually tied with Jamar Chase in targets. Keep in mind, he missed the middle part of the season with that shoulder injury. So everything that we had from the beginning of the season since the injury return showed that T. Higgins was the wide receiver 1B to Jamar Chase's wide receiver 1A, and that you shouldn't be viewing Jamar Chase as a top 5 wide receiver and then viewing T. Higgins as a wide receiver 3. Higgins is squarely in that mold where he is going to be that option that is a top 24 guy pegged in and week out. And with T. Higgins, he comes extremely close to getting there this week. Stopped at like the 1-2 yard line. If Higgins could have found that end zone, I mean, you would have been looking at a massive performance of 97 receiving yards, would have had 100 receiving yards essentially, and that receiving touchdown, which would have vaulted him up to being that high-end wide receiver 2. But he does lead the Cincinnati Bengals in overall receiving yards. This is an offense that decides to throw the ball 34 times here. So we're continuing to see that the Cincinnati Bengals are deciding to just lean on the pass as they have over the past few weeks. So yeah, I mean, I'm not changing my stance at all on T. Higgins. We're going to go through, continue to play Higgins where you have him. And if you have not bought low yet, I think that you could definitely still go through, trade for a wide receiver 2 at a wide receiver 3 price. Go try to get Higgins. Now our next wide receiver will be someone that's been injured. And I know that you're very worried, but he's coming at a super discounted price here. This is going to be Julio Jones. So Julio Jones so far this season is the wide receiver 58 on a points per game basis. I mean, Julio Jones has not played over the past few weeks. I mean, he was actually out in week 8 against the Indianapolis Colts. Looks like he's probably missing week 9 against the Los Angeles Rams. But I think now that we have Derrick Henry ruled out for essentially the rest of the season, now you're going to be seeing this Tennessee Titans have no other option, but the offense is going to have to skew to be a lot more pass happy. So once we get Julio Jones back in here, I think Julio Jones still does have the ceiling based on what we saw in 2020 while he was healthy. And even going back to what we had at the beginning of the season here with Julio Jones healthy, we haven't had many games, but going back to week 2, you saw 8 targets in Tennessee, 6 receptions, 128 receiving yards. Now we have to ask ourselves, what is the exact trade package are we going to go through and send for Julio Jones? Because obviously the price point is not high at all with Julio. So what I think we should be looking to do is try to take some of those depth bench pieces that we have. Like if we can try to pivot over from someone like Cole Beasley and then throw in another just running back that's not giving you much like Darren Johnson, and we could try to pivot over to Julio Jones there, I think that you could actually get a trade done like that in a multitude of different leagues. Of course, you're going to have to go through and change the player names because you're not going to have those guys on all your rosters. But if you go take one of those bench wide receivers that you have that are coming off a strong performance, you package them together with another depth running back that doesn't have an elite level ceiling. You're not trading Tony Pollard. You're not trading Alexander Mattison. You're not trading AJ Dillon. Of course, you're not doing that. But if we can move one of those players like Darren Johnson, I think that'd be fantastic, because if you're moving those bench players that we're not necessarily relying on a week-to-week basis, rather we're rostering them just for their elite level upside, I think Julio Jones does have a lot more upside still at this point than someone else that you would have on your bench. And at this point, we've already gone through a lot of the different bye weeks that we have had so far this season. So you'd naturally assume that's a little bit more important to not necessarily be worrying about the floor that we have with these players, but instead be worrying about the ceiling, which I think is still there for Julio Jones, especially with the injury to Derrick Henry. Now let's go over to our next wide receiver here, which will be an option we hated coming into the season, but I think that he is a clear buy low candidate right now. It's going to be Terry McLaurin. And now with Terry McLaurin in particular, one thing that I really want to discuss is the fact that he's been playing with Taylor Heinicke. I mean, come on. You're never expecting Heinicke to be a great NFL passer despite the small flashes that we have had. And with Terry McLaurin here, he's now going into a bye week, and we're starting to get to that range where we're going to be expecting Ryan Fitzmagic to work his way back in very, very soon. And now that we have this bye week, I would naturally assume that we could probably get Fitzmagic back next game against his former team in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So that would be fantastic for Terry McLaurin in elevating the overall offense, especially if they have a little bit of that DGAF factor. And all of a sudden, this defense is getting up a significant amount of points, assuming that Ryan Fitzmagic is going to be a little more turnover prone than what you would have with Taylor Heinicke. That's going to skew the passing rate for the Washington football team, where the volume will go up for essentially this entire passing offense. And you would naturally assume that you would actually get more efficient quarterback play with Fitzmagic compared to what we would have with Heinicke. So the entire offensive situation is going to get drastically better for Terry McLaurin, who has still been in an okay situation so far this season. Y'all know we are telling y'all to avoid him everywhere in fantasy drafts, so you naturally assume that, with Terry McLaurin so far being low-end wide receiver 2, he is the wide receiver 23 behind options like Sterling Shepard on a points per game basis. You would assume that that means I'm jumping up and down with joy, but no, it's the exact opposite of that. I think with everybody who was drafting Terry McLaurin in the third when I wasn't, I think y'all were right. I was wrong, because if you're looking at the volume that we have had from Terry McLaurin as well, this is an option with 76 targets so far through 8 weeks this season. The volume's there. He's going to be getting an upgrade at quarterback very soon. Now, you don't necessarily have to trade for him now because he's going into the bye. Usually we don't like trading for players going into the bye week. We would prefer trading for them coming out of one. But McLaurin is a little bit of a different example, just because I think more people are going to be discussing next week the fact that you are getting Ryan Fitzmagic back sooner rather than later. So I think that Terry McLaurin is one of those rare exceptions where his value and his price tag could actually increase during the bye. So maybe you trade for Terry McLaurin now. Definitely at least go out there and put out a feeler offer. Now, our next wide receiver is not going to be a wide receiver at all. Rather, he actually operates as a wide receiver in his offense. And this is going to be another one of those elite options. But I think that the price tag is definitely worth it based on what we have heard in those live streams. Darren Waller. Now, I know a lot of y'all are worried about Darren Waller based on the fact that not only do you have the ankle injury that we're kind of thinking about in the back of our minds, but also that this is a tight end that definitely trailed off over the past 3 weeks. So we have had 6 weeks so far from Darren Waller in fantasy. And keep in mind, right now I'm going to be looking at I hate to just use this over and over again, but tight end premium scoring. That's the way that I'm always playing. So that's what I'm going to be looking at. And in the first 3 weeks, weeks 1 through 3, you actually had Darren Waller as the tight end 3 overall. And then if we're going to be looking at weeks 4 through 6, so the next 3 weeks to see that Darren Waller fall off, see exactly how far he actually fell to. Yes, Darren Waller did take that step down, still a top 12 tight end where he was the tight end 11. But if you're just diving in depth, I think with Darren Waller here, this is a tight end that you can see some very positive regression coming in his way very soon. Because you're looking at the fact that this is a tight end that has had the volume, which is what we always talk about here. He has had 53 targets. His target share in his offense is through the roof. Clearly, this is an offense that's fueling everything that they can through Darren Waller. He's had 53 targets with only 2 receiving touchdowns. That is something that has to drastically rise up, given the fact that Waller, I mean, come on, this isn't Keenan Allen. This is a 6'6", 255-pound tight end that operates pretty much as a big slot wide receiver. So you know that touchdown rate is going to be significantly higher. And I know we have some criticism. A lot of people in those live streams that we do every single night are a little bit worried that, I mean, with no John Gruden here, this offense just simply isn't going to use the tight end position. They're not going to use Darren Waller as much as we previously have seen, which I would say, I mean, definitely at first, that was an argument that you could just at least consider, especially when back in week 6, the first week with no John Gruden here, you actually had Darren Waller with only 5 targets, 5 receptions, 59 receiving yards. Definitely the worst stat line of Darren Waller's season. But what we saw in week 7, when Waller was out with that ankle injury, is Foster Moreau coming out and, I mean, having a fantastic fantasy day in his own right, where he was a top 3 tight end in fantasy. And that kind of shows us that this new head coach, honestly, I don't even know his name right now, but it kind of shows us that he is going to be featuring the tight end just as we have previously seen, because we know that the wide receiver profiles that you have with Las Vegas, you got the slot wide receiver with Hunter Renfrow, you got the field stretching wide receiver with Henry Ruggs. I know a lot of film grinders are in love with Bryan Edwards and think that Bryan Edwards is some prototypical alpha X wide receiver that is going to be a target hog in Las Vegas. I think we could safely say at this point, that is not going to be the case. This offense is still going to be built around forcing targets down Darren Waller's throat. So I think we're just going to continue to go through, rank Darren Waller as the tight end 2, tight end 3 rest of season. Of course, our rest of season rankings can be found over there on Patreon. By the time this video comes out, those should be finalized and posted for the week. But yeah, Darren Waller, still that elite tight end coming out of the bye week, should be good to go against the Giants in week 9. Definitely go and try to put out some feeler offers there. And yeah, that's all I got for you. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. Please make sure you go down there, drop that like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel if you, for not whatever reason. And also, you know, we'll be live streaming every night, so hit that bell next to the subscribe button so you know when we go live, so you can come out, ask any questions. And of course, you can find our rest of season rankings. You can get a Fantasy Flock Network hat. You can get our dynasty rankings. You can get a podcast breaking down your fantasy team. You can get pretty much whatever you're looking for over there on Patreon. You can find that link in the description of the video. And yeah, that's all I got for you. Thank you so much for checking it out, and I hope you have a great day.